meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines...
Adolf Hitler never hid his belief that the Soviet Union would be the ultimate prize for his regime. He despised communism and saw the vast open lands and rich natural resources of Soviet Russia as the key to allowing the German people to become the master race. During the early months of 1941, while staying at his retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler formulated his most ambitious plan, Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. With his armies reassembled and re-equipped for what would be their toughest challenge, Hitler turned his focus eastward. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union remained an ally, and Stalin was eager to keep it that way, even though his nation was terribly unprepared for war. The once mighty Red Army, which had been the largest and most modern force in the world, had been severely weakened by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, when roughly 1/3 of its top officers were executed or imprisoned. Despite outward appearances, there had been a catastrophic collapse in its strength and efficiency as German soldiers began flooding into neighboring Poland. Stalin, desperate to preserve peace, ordered that nothing should be done to provoke Hitler. However, before advancing into Russia, Hitler had another task. He needed to secure his southern flank. Although Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary were steadfast allies, in March 1941, a pro-German Yugoslav government was overthrown by forces favoring Britain, and nearby Greece also leaned toward the British side. Thus, on April 6, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. 33 divisions moved into Yugoslavia and quickly broke through its defenses, leading to the surrender of the capital, Belgrade, on April 12th. Greece fell almost as rapidly. Despite British help, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks, clearing the way for Operation Barbarossa. More than 4 million soldiers were set to take part in the offensive, supported by over 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous attacks. Army Group North would sweep through the Baltic states and capture Leningrad, Army Group Center would move toward Moscow, and Army Group South would take control of the Ukraine. When Hitler presented the plan, his generals fell silent. They feared it was overly ambitious and would stretch their forces too thin, yet none dared oppose him. Meanwhile, the Red Army was far larger, with nearly 2 million troops near the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Soviets also fielded over 20,000 tanks compared to Germany's 6,000. Although these tanks were older and less advanced, they still formed a formidable fighting force. Germany's challenge was clear. Could its superior technology and rapid maneuvers defeat the Russians before the vast numbers of the Red Army wore them down? Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. At dawn, the Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields while the ground assault started simultaneously. The Germans quickly crossed the Bug River on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union, and Hitler's tanks pushed deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had advanced more than 50 miles, and the disorganized Soviet counterattacks were swiftly repelled. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured as the Luftwaffe maintained complete control of the skies. The Soviet command appeared stunned by the rapid German advance. On June 29th, just a week after the assault began, 2 tank columns met near Minsk, encircling large groups of Soviet troops. When infantry arrived, over 300,000 prisoners were taken. In many regions, especially in Ukraine where anti-Russian feelings were common, Germans were even welcomed as liberators. In Moscow, Stalin nearly broke down at the news of what he saw as Hitler's betrayal, remaining silent for over a week. It wasn't until July 3rd that he called on his people's patriotism to defend the motherland. In Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill reacted very differently to the news of Operation Barbarossa. It meant that Britain was no longer alone. He declared that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain, regardless of past political differences, and he sent a mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance treaty with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. However, aside from sending some aid by sea, Britain had little it could do immediately to help the Soviet Union. As June turned into July, the German blitzkrieg advanced even further into Soviet territory. It began to seem as if nothing could stop Hitler, until he was about to commit his first major strategic error. In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army soldiers were encircled west of Minsk. Hitler's tank commanders, especially General Hungarian, pleaded to continue their rapid advance because Operation Barbarossa was running like clockwork. Within a week, the tanks had reached Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a few hundred miles from Moscow. On July 22nd, a tank maneuver east of Smolensk trapped another 310,000 Soviet troops. There was a brief pause while the rest of the army caught up. Even though the tanks moved at an incredible pace, most of the infantry still had to march or use horse-drawn transport. Still, it took them only 5 days to arrive and begin clearing the area, and the entire operation was finished in just 9 more days. Huge columns of Soviet prisoners then began marching west into captivity. Over 2.2 million soldiers were captured and never returned. With Moscow now only 200 miles away and the route open, it seemed sure that the city would fall by the end of summer as planned. Elsewhere, however, the German advance was becoming more difficult. The Red Army was fighting back more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kharkov. Hitler decided that Garian's tank forces should pause their drive on Moscow and instead swing south to capture Kharkov in order to offer support. Garian strongly objected, but Hitler was firm that no further move towards Moscow should occur until Kharkov had fallen. This decision would prove fateful. There were already signs that the Red Army would not be the easy target Hitler had expected. Soviet manpower seemed limitless, with over 16 million troops now mobilized, and the Red Army had received powerful new weapons. In particular, a new tank, the T-34, armed with a 76 mm gun and capable of moving faster and handling rough terrain better than the German tanks, had entered service. As the blitzkrieg continued, these warning signs were easy to miss. Garian's tank group began its push south on August 23, 1941. The tanks of Army Group South then moved north, and 3 weeks later, the two forces met east of Kharkov on September 16th. On that same day, 2 more Soviet armies were completely destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. More than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North encircled the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, cutting it off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was then besieged. Hitler chose not to storm Leningrad. Instead, German forces settled in to starve the city into surrender. Conditions inside became desperate, with the only connection to the rest of the Soviet Union being a narrow supply line across Lake Ladoga. Only a small amount of food could reach the city by boat, and starvation soon set in. In November, more than 11,000 people died. It wasn't until December that an ice road was opened across the lake, which allowed for a slight increase in rations. Even so, on one day in December alone, 3,700 people died from starvation. Meanwhile, Army Group Center prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Garian's tank units rejoined the group to lead the blitz. The Germans enjoyed a 2-to-1 advantage in tanks and frontline troops, and a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft. The assault began on September 20th, 1941. Once again, Garian's tanks cut deep into the Red Army, and by October 7th, even more Soviet troops were encircled. Stalin, however, was determined to defend Moscow to the very end. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the city's defense, and the people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. Yet the greatest obstacle to the German advance turned out to be the weather. On October 8th, heavy rain caused German vehicles to become mired in deep mud. By late October, the terrible weather combined with increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant that Army Group Center was still about 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his earlier decision to delay the drive on Moscow. At about the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping even more Soviet soldiers and capturing another 100,000 prisoners, though they, too, were slowed by the weather. Nevertheless, the city of Kharkov was captured on October 24, 1941. But as the weather began to freeze, the German forces, confident that the campaign would be over by summer, found themselves unprepared for winter and lacking proper cold weather gear, so they soon suffered greatly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center started its final push to take the Soviet capital. By December 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square, and some patrols even claimed to see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. That night, however, temperatures plummeted again. Tank engines failed to start, weapons froze, and many soldiers suffered severe frostbite. On December 5th, the Germans halted their attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army, although the Germans remained confident that come spring, they could finish the job. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies were battered by the German attack. At the same time, Stalin worried that the Japanese might strike his forces in Siberia. However, in November, the Soviet leader received a message from his top spy in Japan, assuring him that the Japanese had no plans to attack. Immediately afterward, over 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Moscow. These troops were well equipped and specially trained for winter warfare. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in position near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans were about to give up on capturing Moscow, they were hit by a savage Russian counterattack. First came a massive Soviet artillery barrage, followed by waves of T-34 tanks crashing through the German defenses. Shocked by the ferocity of an enemy they had assumed was weak, the Germans fell back for several days as Soviet forces tore into their ranks. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to stop the Moscow attack, this was a terrible setback. On December 19th, he fired his overall commander, Field Marshal Walter von Breuth, and took control himself. He also dismissed Hinskaran along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler then ordered that there be no more retreats. German troops were told to fight, and if necessary, die, right where they stood. This order helped the German line slowly steady. Meanwhile, an elated Stalin, buoyed by the Red Army's success, demanded a massive advance along the entire front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, fighting raged inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was very uncomfortable. He was used to quick results. Now he was dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union, facing an enemy that simply would not give up. And Russia wasn't his only headache. On December 7th, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. With little thought, Hitler declared war on the US as well, suddenly taking on a massive new enemy. As 1941 turned into 1942, Hitler remained determined to resume the offensive in Russia. But he needed a new strategy. The original plan of fighting along the whole front no longer worked. Furthermore, his economic advisors warned him that Germany's oil supplies were running low, so he decided to halt the northern attacks and instead head for Russia's oil fields in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue called for an assault south of Kov, with Army Group A swinging down to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B secured its flank along the river. At dawn, there was an immediate brutal clash with Soviet forces trying to retake Kov. In that operation, another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured and 70,000 were killed. The Germans then tightened their siege of the port of Sebastopol in Crimea, which lasted for 8 long months. The defenders were under constant bombardment from German artillery. Even a massive 400 mm railway gun was used. In late June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans, clearing the way to move toward the oil fields. On June 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way to the River Dawn and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A met stiffer resistance, but by July 9th, it was close to Rostov. Then Hitler made a series of serious strategic mistakes. As Army Group B advanced along the Dawn, he ordered it to capture Stalingrad, even though the city had no immediate strategic value. This sudden new task added a massive burden to the army. 2 weeks later, frustrated by the slow progress of the Caucasus campaign, Hitler worsened his error by diverting most of his tanks into the mountains. This move noticeably slowed the march on Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the reinforced Army Group A raced across the Caucasus, reaching within 70 miles of the Caspian Sea and threatening to cut off all Soviet armies in the area. But then, Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress towards Stalingrad, he ordered the tanks to move back north. On August 9th, Army Group A captured the first of the southern oil fields at Em. They found the area completely trashed, and without reinforcements, they could not advance further. The huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and near the Caspian Sea remained beyond their reach. By late August, however, Hitler's focus shifted once more. German forces were now within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, named after Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun, and it would become one of the most crucial battles of World War II. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich's Sixth Army crossed the Don River and began a final push towards Stalingrad. 6 days later, one panzer unit reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were battling on its outskirts. At that moment, Hitler seemed set for a famous victory. Stalingrad was a key industrial center, stretching for more than 12 miles along the west bank of the river. Its factories produced over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors, trucks, tanks, and guns. The Russian people had turned the city into a strong fortress, and Hitler's decision to send Army Group B's panzers south had given the defenders an extra 2 weeks to prepare. The German plan was to launch a direct assault on the city, beginning one of the longest and most intense battles of World War II. Slowly, the Germans advanced street by street, with dive bombs exploding just ahead of them. The fighting was brutal, house by house, and the Soviet defenders even took shelter in the sewers, using them for communication while snipers occupied the ruined buildings above. Russian reinforcements had to be ferried across the river, often while under heavy air attack, yet thousands still managed to get through. By late September, the Germans had pushed deep into the city, nearly reaching its center. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad had become an obsession. On October 4, 1942, General Paulus launched what was meant to be the final assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the attack, crushing rubble and firing point-blank into courtyards. One German officer commented that their progress was measured in corpses, not meters. Although German victories seemed certain, by mid-November the troops were dangerously overextended. The Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 132,000 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. One German officer commented that their progress was measured in corpses, not meters. Although German victories seemed certain, by mid-November the troops were dangerously overextended. The Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 132,000 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November 19th, the Soviets attacked the German northern flank. After a massive artillery barrage, T-34 tanks and assault infantry burst through the German lines. Soon, it was the Germans who began surrendering in the thousands. The next day, a Soviet assault in the south was just as successful. By November 23rd, these Soviet movements met west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German Sixth Army. General Paulus, in command of the German forces, could have broken out, but Hitler ordered him to stand and fight. Promised by the Luftwaffe that enough supplies could be airlifted into Stalingrad, Hitler declared that the German positions must hold until relief arrived. To help Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Germany's overall commander in the region, launched Operation Winterstorm on December 12th. This operation aimed to break the Soviet encirclement of the city. For 2 days the attempt went well, but then Soviet resistance grew. By December 23rd, the German rescue effort had stalled about 30 miles from the city. Manstein advised Paulus to try to break out, but Paulus waited for Hitler's permission, which was refused. It was likely too late. Meanwhile, Marshal Zhukov launched the next phase of his plan, a massive assault on the Panzer Relief Operation. the panzers were pushed back from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had vanished. To make matters worse, plans to airlift supplies into the city turned out to be a disaster. The German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive, yet they never received more than 80 tons. The weather was terrible, and the Soviet Air Force now controlled the skies. Gradually, Soviet forces squeezed in around the encircled Germans. By January 8th, 200,000 German soldiers were trapped, and when the Soviets called on them to surrender, they refused. Then, on January 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. Over 100,000 men were taken prisoner, only 5,000 of whom would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a brutal, bloody battle. The Germans were devastated, losing about 300,000 men and at least as many of their allies, while the Russians suffered similar losses, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's worst disaster in the war so far, and it would not be the last. The Red Army was now handing Hitler massive defeats across the entire Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a huge victory for the Soviet army. With renewed momentum, Marshal Zhukov turned his attention to Germany's Army Group A, which was still stationed in the Caucasus. Soviet troops pushed west of Stalingrad, and by early December 1942, they were within 120 miles of Rostov. There was a real chance that all the German forces in the south would be cut off. With little choice, Hitler reluctantly allowed Army Group A to fall back. Over the next month, the Germans fought a skillful rearguard action as hundreds of thousands of troops withdrew. Then, on January 12, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out assault along a 500-mile front, outnumbering the Germans 7-1. Field Marshal von Manstein, the overall commander of German forces in the area, conducted a brilliant mobile retreat, but by the end of February, the Red Army had recaptured both Kay and the nearby city of Kov. This Russian winter offensive had dealt a crippling blow to German power. Within months, Germany lost 1 million men and vast numbers of tanks and guns. Meanwhile, the Red Army still had enormous manpower reserves, and with increased weapons production and aid from the United States and Britain, the Germans no longer held the technological edge. The T-34 tank outmatched the Panzer Mark IV, and the Soviets' fearsome Katyusha,
and look into his blue eyes.
Decimated
The
German
enthusiasm
forces.
of thousands of people constantly shouting.
He still dreamed of a preemptive summer assault that would catch the Soviet Union off balance and regain the initiative. The city of Kayquer, as it was called, seemed like the obvious starting point. The Soviet attack had created a deep bulge in the German lines, making it look vulnerable. Hitler decided it should be cut off and destroyed. He also had an ace up his sleeve, a new generation of tanks designed specifically to counter the powerful Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55-ton Tiger carried a lethal 88mm gun and had thick frontal armor that made it nearly immune to Soviet tank guns. Then there was the faster 43-ton Panther with a new 75mm gun, also capable of knocking out the T-34. These tanks were so new that Hitler had to delay the attack until enough were manufactured and delivered to the front. Even as the German forces began to assemble, Soviet commander Marshal Zhukov sensed what was coming. Soon he received word from a Soviet spy inside the German High Command confirming the planned attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank ditches, minefields and thick belts of barbed wire. He also greatly reinforced the area by pulling in troops and tanks from less exposed parts of the front. By the eve of the assault on Kursk, the Germans were vastly outnumbered by Soviet defenders, who already knew when the attack would come. On July 5, 1943, just as the German troops prepared to launch their assault, they were hit by a massive Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning the panzers rolled forward, but this time they faced a well-entrenched enemy, and a quick, lightning blitzkrieg breakthrough was impossible. The results were disastrous. In the north, the German army advanced only 6 miles at the cost of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans managed to drive a 25-mile deep wedge into the Soviet defenses, but at a heavy price. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks destroyed. For a brief moment, it looked as if a breakthrough might be possible, but on July 12, 1943, Zhukov committed his reserves. 900 tanks charged into the German positions. Soon, almost 2,000 tanks were engaged in what became the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34S broke into the German lines and fired at point-blank range. After just one day of brutal combat, the Germans lost another 350 tanks and began to retreat. Meanwhile, an epic air battle raged overhead. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force gained complete control of the skies. With air supremacy, the Russians unleashed their powerful IL-2 storm of tank kills. By July 23rd, the Germans had lost all the ground they had gained, along with the best elements of their army. Hitler's adventure at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and more than 700 tanks. After that, the Germans would never launch another major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Russians had turned the tide of the war. The Soviet steamroller, after Hitler's gamble in the East failed, unable to defeat Stalingrad and Moscow, the Soviet Union, with its vast resources and enormous armies, began to slowly push back and grow stronger. Hitler was now on the defensive on two-thirds of his fronts. Summer 1943, on the Eastern Front, Hitler's armies were losing ground. Soviet artillery and tank attacks were tearing through German defenses. By this time, Hitler was fighting on two fronts. In Western Europe, British and American forces were moving up through Italy, threatening Germany from the south. The Germans had to pull some of their best troops from the Eastern Front to help, leaving their forces stretched too thin. The exhausted German soldiers now faced the massive reserves of the powerful Soviet military. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin saw his chance to strike back and launched a major attack. By early August 1943, the Red Army had pushed the Germans out of Oryol and Belgorod. To celebrate, Stalin ordered a huge fireworks display in Moscow's Red Square, with 12 rounds of cannon fire. He declared, "Eternal glory to the heroes who died for freedom, death to the German invaders." Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler reacted by taking even more personal control over key military decisions. His influence was felt almost immediately by Axis troops defending the vital city of Kharkov. As Soviet forces closed in from three sides, German commander Erich von Manstein ordered a strategic retreat. Hitler overruled him, demanding that Kharkov must be defended at all costs. He refused to give up any land, believing Germany needed it to secure its future. He was convinced that Germany would win, not by numbers, but by sheer determination. The Germans dug in. At first, Hitler's plans seemed to work. For several days, Soviet attacks were held back. More than 300 Russian T-34 tanks were destroyed. But by late August 1943, German defenses were overwhelmed. Finally, Manstein went against Hitler's orders and commanded his troops to pull out. The next day, the Red Army took over the ruined city of Kharkov. This marked the start of a massive Soviet offensive along a 500-mile front, stretching from Rostov in the south to Smolensk in the north. Near Rostov in the south, a Soviet breakthrough threatened to trap thousands of German troops in Crimea. Once again, Manstein requested permission to retreat. Hitler's response was brief: "Do nothing, I'm coming myself." But he never showed up. Instead, the German army was forced into another desperate last-minute retreat. The situation got worse as bands of Soviet partisans, battle-hardened fighters who had been trapped behind enemy lines, ambushed retreating German forces. They cut off German communication and supply lines. The Germans responded with brutal force, punishing civilians in revenge. They also carried out a scorched earth policy, destroying everything in their path. Factories, power plants, railways and bridges were blown up. A massive hydroelectric dam that powered all of Ukraine was destroyed. Meanwhile, in the center of the front, the Germans pulled back across the Dnieper River. As they retreated, they blew up bridges, turning the river into a powerful natural barrier. Then, they set up defensive positions along the western bank. In response, Stalin made an announcement. The first Soviet soldier to cross the river would receive the country's highest honor. By early autumn 1943, Soviet forces had established several small bridgeheads on the German-held West Bank. Fierce battles raged along the Dnieper River throughout October 1943. Finally, at the start of November, Soviet forces captured Kiev. All along the river, the Germans were pushed out of their positions and forced to retreat even further. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had almost completely driven the Germans out of Russia. They were now advancing westward, through Ukraine. Europe's fate was beginning to change. By the end of 1943, The Red Army had almost completely driven the Germans out of Russia. They were now advancing westward, through Ukraine. Europe's fate was beginning to change. By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat. The Soviet leadership was sending ever larger numbers of troops and more equipment. The Germans still had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V, both well suited for mobile defensive warfare, which was the only hope left for the German forces on the Eastern Front. However, the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly T-34s, and factories in Siberia were producing about 2,000 tanks a month. Meanwhile, Hitler was forced to split his forces to fight on two fronts. Stalin's war machine was working at full speed. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Kon, the last town on what the Germans had hoped would be their defensive line along the river. 12 days later, the Second Ukrainian Front advanced on the southern side. The attack followed a well-established Soviet plan. First, they built up overwhelming numbers of troops, so that the Germans never knew exactly where the first assault would hit. Then came a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, masses of T-34 tanks punched holes in the German defenses, and finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became clear that the Germans were about to be overwhelmed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, begging yet again for permission to retreat, but Hitler refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as a Corona pocket. The Soviets nicknamed it Little Stalingrad. The German forces then tried to break out, but the Russians were ready. T-34 tanks and close support infantry attacked the Germans as they attempted to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days. By the time Korsun fell, the Germans had lost roughly 30,000 men. The Red Army now advanced quickly. Their speed was helped by fleets of trucks, mostly provided by the United States, that kept their forces supplied. This process was much faster than for the Germans, who still relied heavily on horses. The Russians also dominated the skies. The Luftwaffe had always been a key part of the German war effort, but Hitler was forced to shift many aircraft to defend the homeland from US and British bombing raids. As a result, Russian planes outnumbered the Luftwaffe 5-1. The Red Air Force's Storm 5 fighter bombers took a heavy toll on German armor and supply convoys. Yet Hitler refused to consider defeat and announced a new version of his no-retreat policy. He ordered his troops to create what he called fortified areas, or local strongholds that were to be defended to the bitter end. Only with his personal approval could any of these fortresses be abandoned. It was a desperate plan that would cost the Germans dearly. One of the first tests of this new strategy was near the Ukrainian town of Kadet Podolsky. Here, 20 divisions of panzers were at risk of being cut off, but Hitler declared it a fortified area and refused to allow a retreat despite fierce fighting. A bitter argument erupted between Hitler and Manstein, who clearly saw the writing on the wall. Finally, Manstein prevailed, and the panzers were given permission to break out. 10 days later, about 200,000 men of the 1st Panzer Army safely reached the German lines over 100 miles to the west, though they lost most of their heavy equipment and weapons. By now, Manstein's repeated requests to retreat had become too much for Hitler, and the field marshal was sacked. Further south, the Germans tried to hold back the Soviet torrent along the Dniester River, but they failed. A large force of Germans was cut off behind Russian lines in the Black Sea port of Odessa. They too ended up being isolated. In early April 1944, Hitler declared Odessa a fortress, but the German troops ignored him and slipped out of the city several days later. On April 10th, Odessa was liberated. By the beginning of 1944, the Russian city of Leningrad had been under siege by German forces for nearly 2.5 years. During that first winter, almost 500,000 people died from starvation. Volunteers struggled to put out fires and build defenses, but by 1944 life in the city had become almost unbearable. Several relief efforts had failed. One in 1942 resulted in more than 50,000 troops of the Soviet Second Shock Army being captured, and another in 1943 managed only to send a trickle of supplies into the city. Even so, throughout 1943, around 20,000 people continued to die each month from cold, disease, and hunger. By January 1944, with the Germans in full retreat, Stalin turned his attention to the suffering city. That month, Soviet forces secretly moved onto the neighboring peninsula around Oran Brook. The attack on the German positions began with a fierce 65-minute bombardment, and Russian troops then broke into the surprised German lines. At the same time, another Soviet force attacked from the northeast of the city, and for 3 days they shattered the German defenses. The German commander, Field Marshal Georg von Klehr, finally asked Hitler for permission to withdraw, but as always, Hitler refused. Klehr argued that only a swift retreat would save his army from a massacre, yet Hitler still said no. Eventually, Hitler fired him and replaced him with General Walter Murder, known as Hitler's fireman, for his fierce loyalty and strong Nazi views. Even so, the danger was obvious, and the new commander disobeyed Hitler by pulling out. After 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted, though nearly 1 million Russian civilians had died. Relief for the city was overwhelming. The first fallout was felt in pro-German Finland, which now feared a Soviet invasion. In March 1944, a secret Finnish delegation went to Moscow to discuss peace. Stalin's terms were harsh. He demanded the Petamo region in northern Finland, an area rich in nickel, a key material for metal alloys, and reparations of $600 million. The Finns refused and prepared for a Soviet attack, but Finland could wait, as the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, had more urgent issues further south. Further south, late 1943 Red Army offensives in Ukraine had trapped 120,000 German troops in Crimea. As usual, Hitler refused to let them withdraw, leaving them to wait helplessly for the Soviet attack. In early April, 2 months after Leningrad was relieved, the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front crashed into Crimea from the north. At the same time, a diversionary attack landed on the eastern end of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis troops on the west side gave way and fell back to the port of Sevastopol, and Hitler ordered that Sevastopol be held at all costs. They stood little chance. Within 2 weeks of the siege, German troops were evacuated by sea. About 40,000 men escaped, but roughly 30,000 defenders were still trapped in the port. They retreated to the beach south of the city, hoping for rescue by more German ships, but that never happened. The evacuation was halted by a Soviet artillery barrage, and 3 days later, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, in the northwest of the country, the Germans still held much of what is now Belarus. But the Red Army had taken a vast bulge of land stretching into Poland and Romania. This meant the Germans had to defend a 400-mile front, leaving them hugely overextended. Logic suggested that they should withdraw to more manageable defensive positions, yet Hitler, obsessed with gaining more territory, refused any further retreat. As a result, the German military continued to suffer heavily from Hitler's constant interference and unrealistic orders. By the spring of 1944, Hitler's forces were stretched to their limit. Along the entire Eastern Front, there was an urgent need for reinforcements. The German High Command faced a tough problem: where to use their few remaining resources most effectively. Intelligence reports had warned that the next major Soviet offensive would hit Belarus, but Hitler disagreed. He was convinced that Stalin would attack in the south and take over the Romanian oil fields. In the end, both ideas were wrong. In early summer, the Red Army shifted its focus to Finland. Russian troops crossed the Kola Peninsula, and after 2 days of fighting, the Finns were forced to retreat. Over the next month, the Red Army advanced north into Finland. By August 1944, the fighting was over, and Finland soon sued for peace. This was the first sign of a pattern that would soon spread across Europe. Stalin began seizing territory, in this case, parts of Finnish Karelia and the nickel-rich Petsamo region. Next, Stalin turned his attention to Central Europe. In the summer of 1944, he launched Operation Barbarossa, named after a Russian hero of the Napoleonic Wars. At 5 a.m. on June 22nd, exactly 3 years after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Army began a fierce bombardment of German forces in what is now Belarus. This was the very area that German intelligence had predicted a Soviet attack would occur. But because Hitler had ignored those warnings, it was very weakly defended. A major mistake. The Germans were soon being hammered along a 350-mile front, with Soviet forces using over 400 guns per mile in some areas. The barrage was followed by a flood of Soviet tanks and infantry crashing into the German defenses. To make matters worse, the Germans had almost no air support because much of the Luftwaffe was busy defending the homeland from US and British bombers. Hitler's error of fighting a war on two fronts became all too clear. The Red Air Force operated almost without opposition. Russian planes penetrated deep behind German lines, cutting off communications and disrupting reinforcements. Within 36 hours, the German panzers were swept aside. About 50,000 men in the German-held town of Vitebsk were encircled. As had become routine, Hitler first refused to allow a retreat, and then, when he finally relented the next day, it was too late for many soldiers. 4 days later, Vitebsk fell. 20,000 of his men were killed and another 10,000 captured. Further south along the Belarus front, the same pattern repeated. An enraged Hitler fired his General Field Marshal, Erich von Busch, once more and replaced him with his favorite, the newly promoted Field Marshal Walter Merl. But nothing changed. Town after town fell. The regional capital, Minsk, was now within reach. 2 days later, the Red Army encircled it. Over 100,000 German troops were trapped, and after heavy Soviet bombardment, the remaining German forces surrendered within a week. The unstoppable Russian advance then pushed on toward the Baltic states. First, the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, fell. Across the entire Eastern Front, the Germans were in retreat, leaving behind ruined towns and devastated countryside. They even committed widespread atrocities against local people. Yet nothing could have prepared the Red Army for what they discovered on July 23, 1944. Soviet forces reached the small Polish village of Miednik near Lublin. There, they found the first evidence of Hitler's final solution, the Miednik extermination camp, designed for the industrial-scale murder of Jews. When the first Soviet reports of this discovery leaked out, the Western Allies simply dismissed them. 3 days after taking Miednik, the Russians advanced toward Warsaw, but at that point the Red Army paused. St. Darin now stood ready to do what Hitler had done before, grab land not in the name of Lands Real but of. By the summer of 1944, Operation Barbarossa had torn the heart out of the German army in the east. More than 300,000 Axis soldiers had been killed, and another 150,000 taken prisoner. The Red Army then stopped its advance and dug in along the Vistula River, just south of Warsaw. Stalin wasn't in a hurry to finish the war. With Europe in chaos, conditions were perfect for spreading communism. The first victims of Stalin's political plans were the Poles. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose up in Warsaw against its Nazi occupiers, but they desperately needed help. Although the Red Army was camped just to the south and in a good position to assist, Stalin saw the Polish Home Army as too close to the Polish government in exile in London and as opponents of communism. So he turned a blind eye, and the Polish fighters were brutally crushed. The Germans would not be completely driven from Poland until the Red Army pushed them out in January 1945. This was the start of a Soviet plan that would eventually install communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. To the north, Red Army units continued clearing the Germans from the Baltic states, which would later be absorbed into the Soviet Union. Near Riga, the capital of Latvia, over 200,000 Germans were trapped behind Russian lines. Still, Hitler, determined to hold on to what he called his Lebensraum, refused to allow a retreat. Even so, German forces were slowly pushed back to the Baltic coast. By mid-October 1944, the Germans had been squeezed onto the Courland Peninsula, west of Riga, where they would remain isolated for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, Stalin was already eyeing more territory in Eastern Europe. Instead of moving directly toward Germany, units of the Red Army surged south in a massive push through the Balkans. In late August 1944, nearly 1,500 tanks and 1 million men stormed into Romania. The defending Axis forces there had fewer than 400 tanks and only about 800,000 troops. Pro-German Romanian soldiers fell apart almost immediately. 3 days later, large groups of German troops were surrounded near Chisinau. Hitler issued his usual no-retreat order, and for 9 days bitter fighting ensued. Over 180,000 German soldiers were either killed or captured, and the rest were forced to retreat belatedly. In late August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was arrested. By the end of the month, Romania surrendered. The Red Army entered Bucharest and took control of the strategically crucial Romanian oil fields. cutting off Germany's main oil supply. 3 Soviet armies then advanced south into Bulgaria. Although Bulgaria had tried to remain neutral, it too would soon fall under Soviet control. At the same time, Russian forces pushed west toward Yugoslavia. In the south, German troops in Greece were at risk of being trapped, so they began a frantic retreat up through Albania and southern Yugoslavia, constantly harried by partisan fighters from both Albania and Yugoslavia. By mid-October 1944, the Red Army reached Belgrade, the Yugoslav capital. Only then did their advance turn north and west toward Hungary, and eventually Germany. German reinforcements poured into Hungary to support the Prague puppet government, but the Red Army continued its grinding advance. 8 weeks later, it laid siege to Budapest. That siege lasted over 6 weeks, until the German puppet government finally collapsed. By the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe was firmly in Stalin's grip. His troops controlled the Baltic states and Poland. Pro-Soviet forces ruled in Romania and Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, Albania, Hungary and Czechoslovakia were next on his list. Stalin had successfully laid the foundations for the future Soviet bloc and could now finally move on to Germany. But in the west, Allied forces were also closing in on the German border. The race was on to be the first to break into Germany. After careful planning and strict secrecy, and largely because Hitler wasn't paying attention, the Allies managed to breach mainland Western Europe through the Normandy landings. Although thousands of lives were lost in the operation, it allowed the Allies to begin liberating Western Europe. By 1944, on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces were being pushed back to the German border. At the same time, Germany faced a new threat in the west. For months, Allied forces had been preparing to open a new front in northwest France. Training was well underway. However, it was an attack that Hitler had long expected. His real problem was knowing exactly when, and most importantly, where it would come. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of World War II, D-Day, the Allied landings along the Normandy coast of France. Since the early years of the war, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been convinced that an Allied invasion of Northern Europe would eventually be necessary. The only questions were when, where, and how. To test the waters, British forces had already conducted several trial operations. In December 1941, British commandos raided the Vargo Islands off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway to probe German defenses and keep some of Hitler's troops tied up in the north. They blew up a fish oil factory and coastal defenses before withdrawing. 8 months later, Canadian and British troops attempted a larger raid on the French port of Dieppe. This raid was designed both to test the defenses and to give the Canadians combat experience, but it turned into a disaster. As landing craft approached the main beach, they were met with intense fire. Those who made it ashore were quickly pinned down, and supporting tanks became stuck in the shingle while trying to scale the seawall. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or captured. The operation taught a hard lesson: never launch a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Equally important, the Dieppe disaster convinced the British that an invasion of Europe could not be rushed. Churchill understood that careful planning was essential. Eventually, in April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed on a date. D-Day, officially known as Operation Overlord, a seaborne invasion of France, was set for the summer of 1944. But by that time, the Germans were preparing for it in earnest. Since the winter of 1941, they had been building the Atlantic Wall, a massive series of fortifications along the European coast, from Denmark to the Spanish border. Gun emplacements were set up at likely landing spots. Beaches were mined and filled with barbed wire, and obstacles were placed to block landing craft. Hitler boasted, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." In the summer of 1942, after the Dieppe raid, work on the Atlantic Wall was stepped up even further. Hitler also ordered more troops into the region. The German commander in the west, Field Marshal G. von Reunet, was given 15 extra divisions, but the Western European coast stretched for about 2,000 miles, and he simply did not have enough troops to cover the entire line. Von Reunet faced a tough choice. Where should he position his stretched thin forces for maximum effect? This led to bitter debates among the German leadership. Von Rüne proposed keeping a large reserve of panzers in northwest Paris so that he could launch them against an invasion once its location was known. However, Field Marshal Irvin, the respected commander responsible for the area from Holland along the French coast to the Loire, had a different opinion. He was very concerned about Allied air power. He had seen its devastating effects in North Africa and was convinced that any counterattack would be broken up by Allied planes before it could really begin. Irvin inspected Hitler's Atlantic Wall and found many weaknesses. He believed the best place to position the panzers was as close as possible to the most likely landing sites, so that an invasion could be stopped immediately before it gained any footing. They are a testament to, in the end, Hitler compromised. Von Rüne was allowed to hold a small force in reserve, with Hitler having the final say on when to use it, while the rest of the additional troops were spread along the entire Atlantic coast, according to Irvin's plan. This turned out to be a poor solution. There simply were not enough reserves or tanks near the coast. But in the autumn of 1943, none of this was yet clear. In Britain, Allied planners were also debating where to land. Their chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, quickly realized that there were two main options: the Pas-de-Calais or Normandy. Pas-de-Calais was favored by many because it offered the shortest sea crossing and a direct route into Germany. However, it was also the most obvious choice, and Morgan was sure the Germans were expecting it. So he decided to surprise them by landing in Normandy instead. This marked the beginning of a huge gamble on which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend. In the autumn of 1943, Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft flew over the beaches of northern France as part of an enormous planning effort for the seaborne invasion of Europe. They carefully monitored the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, gathering vital information for the upcoming assault. Human creativity, both in their craftsmanship resistance fighters, secretly went ashore to collect sand samples to see if armored vehicles could land. Northern France soon became the most closely watched coastline in the history of warfare. It quickly became clear that any landing would need some kind of port facilities. However, the disaster at Dieppe had shown that a direct assault on a German-held port was too dangerous. Britain's planners then devised an ingenious alternative. They built huge, hollow concrete boxes in Britain that could later be towed to the French coast. Once there, these boxes would be sunk to form an artificial harbour, codenamed Mulberries. These temporary harbours would be supplied with fuel via a pipeline unrolled from giant reels and laid on the seabed for about 100 miles. The pumping station on the Isle of Wight was even disguised as an ice cream parlour. But the Dieppe raid had revealed another problem: how to get the first wave of troops off the beaches and past the German fortifications. The man tasked with solving this was General Percy Hobart, one of the pioneers of armoured warfare. Hobart came up with a series of clever devices that the troops nicknamed the Funnies. They included machines like flamethrowers and floating tanks, flail tanks for clearing mines, the bobbin for creating firm paths across sand or shingle, an armoured ramp for scaling seawalls, a fine carrier to deal with ditches, and a bridging device for wider obstacles. This left one final challenge: how to stop the Germans from rushing in with overwhelming reinforcements before the Allies could establish a foothold. The answer was to keep the Germans guessing until the last moment. Operation Bodyguard was a massive, complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain began sending huge amounts of carefully planned false information back to Germany, emphasizing that the main landings would occur in the Pas-de-Calais, even though a smaller attack might be launched in Normandy to muddy the waters further. The Allied military even created a fake army unit, the so-called 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG. It was visibly stationed in southeast England, opposite the Pas-de-Calais. Its commander was the pistol-toting US General George Patton, who had been sidelined in Sicily after an incident with shocked soldiers. The Germans considered Patton the best attacking general among the Allies, the very man they expected to lead the invasion of Western Europe. To add to the ruse, wireless transmissions mimicked the traffic of an entire army. The fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and fake tire tracks. Dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas were positioned around, and fake landing craft filled the harbours along the Kent coast. Even some troops were placed there, but these were really backup units. In late 1943, the Allies appointed US General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. while British General Bernard Montgomery would command the initial assault forces. D-Day was set for June 5, 1944. 2 months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air campaign to disrupt German connections to the coast. This was carefully designed to make the Germans believe that the Allied target was the Pas-de-Calais region. As the invasion date approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million, supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans were well aware an invasion was coming, but they were completely fooled by the massive Allied preparations in Kent, and they were convinced that the most likely landing spot was the Pas-de-Calais. Everything seemed to be going in the Allies' favor. The troops were briefed, but then the weather turned. Rain pounded down, visibility dropped, and the channel became stormy. Nevertheless, on June 4, 1944, the assault troops boarded their landing ships, and an armada of over 5,000 vessels set sail. However, the rain continued, and later that day the invasion had to be postponed. The ships returned to port, and the troops faced a nerve-wracking wait. Early the next morning, the military leadership met again. The naval commanders were eager to go, but the air chiefs were doubtful. They worried that visibility would still be too poor for effective air support. After a long silence, Eisenhower finally said, "Let's go." With that, Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion ever, was underway. D-Day had begun.